In the winter of 1834, Virginia's hills concealed more than frost and silence. Beneath one family's estate, a hidden chamber would betray secrets too cruel for ordinary memory. Its discovery began not with officials or scholars, but with whispers that refused to die. Welcome back. Before we continue, like, subscribe, share. The account before us belongs not only to the archives of lore, but to the whispered testimony of those who lived near the Holloway farm. Though today the Holloway name rests silent on weathered stones, its echo is carved into the darker recesses of American history. What emerged from that soil in 1834 was not an accident, nor the madness of a single deranged soul, but the deliberate labor of a household that masked brutality behind civility. The Holloway family was, by all appearances, respectable. Jacob Holloway, the patriarch, was recorded as a man of means, a landowner, a merchant in agricultural goods, and to neighbors, a stern but upright figure. His wife Margaret held herself in the same image, hosting gatherings marked by restraint and formality. Their children, when spoken of at all, were described as serious, quiet, almost spectral in their reserve. Yet behind that stillness lay a pattern so meticulous in its cruelty that later generations would struggle to reconcile the public image with the private record. It began with rumors. Farmers who passed the Holloway property on moonless nights swore they heard faint sounds not of animals nor machinery, but human voices muffled in a low chorus. Some dismissed them as tricks of wind through hollow beams, while others whispered of itinerant workers being mistreated. Yet no one pressed further, for the Holloways carried influence, and in 1834 Virginia, the boundary between suspicion and accusation was perilous. The turning point arrived with William Hutchinson, a field hand who traveled the ridge roads by habit. In testimony preserved decades later, Hutchinson recalled stopping near the Holloway orchard and hearing a rhythmic clanking beneath the soil. He described it not as laboring tools, but as the irregular drag of metal chains. That night's recollection, dismissed by some, lingered with him until it found sympathetic ears. The first official response came from Sheriff Thomas Crawford, a man not known for zealotry but rather for cautious pragmatism. Crawford had grown uneasy with prior disappearances of children reported in surrounding counties. Orphans, vagrants, even sons and daughters of poor tenant families had slipped into absence, often dismissed as runaway. Hutchinson's report, coupled with Rebecca Dorsey's whispered testimony of strange happenings within the Holloway home, compelled Crawford to investigate. Dorsey, once employed briefly as a domestic within the house, carried memories that haunted her speech. She claimed that the Holloway children were not permitted to play freely, that entire wings of the home remained sealed, and that during one moonlit evening she had been tasked with delivering food not upstairs but below, into the stone foundation. What she saw there, narrow corridors, barred doors, and small figures moving in the shadows, unsettled her so deeply that she fled service without collecting her pay. For years she kept silent, fearing disbelief, until Hutchinson's account rekindled the image. On December 14, 1834, Crawford entered the Holloway estate, accompanied by deputies. His initial inspection revealed little beyond a stern household, its patriarch offended by intrusion. Yet during the search, one deputy noted irregular stonework along the cellar wall as though sections had been resealed repeatedly. Crawford ordered it broken. What lay beyond would mark the Holloway name forever. Behind the false wall stretched a basement chamber larger than the house itself, dug deep into the hillside, its ceiling supported by crude timbers. Iron rings studded the stone, and from these hung chains, 47 in total, each shackled to wrists or ankles of children. The sight froze the men in place, rows of malnourished bodies, eyes dulled by darkness, some unable to stand, others too weak to cry out. In that single moment, speculation became fact, and the Holloway residence transformed into a crime scene unlike any previously recorded in Virginia. The rescue, if one dares call it that, was chaotic. Deputies rushed lanterns into the chamber, the sudden light burning the captive's eyes. Several children shrieked and shielded their faces, while others cowered as if expecting punishment. Crawford himself staggered back, struggling to command his men in the presence of such orchestrated misery. Among the survivors, the youngest appeared no more than 4 years old, the oldest perhaps 12. None bore the clarity of speech expected of their age, for confinement had bent their growth as surely as malnutrition. News spread with a velocity that outpaced the law's ability to contain it. By dawn, neighbors gathered near the Holloway gates, whispering of satanic rites, of medical experiments, of curses woven into bloodlines. Some accounts turned to myth even before official statements could be issued. But in the sheriff's own handwritten report, preserved in county records, the words remain spare. Basement discovered, 47 miners in chains, condition severe, Holloway family present, further action required. What troubled authorities even in those first hours was not merely the crime itself, but its duration. Marks upon the stone indicated years of habitation. Chains bore grooves where restless wrists had worn metal and the Holloways, despite their protestations, could not have lived above without awareness of what festered below. Neighbors who once praised Jacob Holloway now spoke with unease. They recalled how his wagons traveled late at night, how deliveries to his store were often concealed, how he discouraged visitors beyond his orchard. Margaret's composure, too, was re-examined. Her rigid grace now appeared as complicit. Even the Holloway children, withdrawn and silent, were recast not as shy heirs, but as participants in something unspeakable. By the close of that winter day, the Holloway name had shifted from esteem to infamy. Officials secured the property, sealing the chamber after removing the captive. Families of missing children crowded the courthouse steps, some recognizing faces among the rescued, others waiting in vain. What began as rumor now stood exposed, a reign of secrecy, calculation, and cruelty operating in plain sight. This was only the beginning. The depth of the Holloway family's designs, and the reasons why 47 children lay chained beneath their home, would not be fully reckoned in that moment. The records that followed, testimonies, court transcripts, medical notes would reveal layers of intent more disturbing than the crime itself. But on that December day in 1834, Virginia bore witness to the first unsealing of a horror long hidden. The Holloway case, as it came to be known, did not end with the basement's unsealing. In truth, that moment marked only the threshold. What followed was a slow and terrible unraveling of details that the community, the law, and even physicians of the time struggled to comprehend. The rescued children were carried out under blankets, some unable to walk, others staring with hollow eyes into the winter air as though sunlight itself were an injury. Crawford's deputies brought them first to the county hall, where townsfolk crowded the steps in silence. Many could not bring themselves to look directly at the victims. The spectacle was overwhelming, not because of bloodshed or violence witnessed in the act, but because of the undeniable evidence of years of deprivation pressed into such small and fragile frames. Doctors, summoned to examine the children, wrote accounts that remain in fragments today. Their reports spoke of limbs unnaturally thin, spines curved from prolonged sitting against stone, teeth missing far earlier than expected, and skin bearing not only the marks of shackles, but the pallor of lives starved of sun. Language faltered in these notes. The physicians, steeped in their 19th century lexicon of humors and constitutions, struggled to name what they saw. Words such as atrophy, imbecility, and wasting recur in their records, but beneath the clinical surface one detects a deeper shock, the recognition that what stood before them was not accident but design. Within days, questions multiplied. Who were these children? How had they come into Holloway hands? And why, of all possible cruelties, had they been bound and hidden rather than simply abandoned? Neighbors began piecing together memories of travelers who had passed through and never returned, of notices posted for missing sons and daughters, of strangers asking after kin who had vanished near the river. When names were compared to the children rescued, matches emerged, not all but enough to confirm that disappearances, once dismissed as misfortune or flight, had in fact been absorbed into a single household secret. The Holloways maintained silence. Jacob, when pressed, denied knowledge of the chamber, claiming it predated his ownership. Margaret echoed him, suggesting that servants had acted without their awareness. Yet such defenses collapsed swiftly when deputies found keys hidden within Jacob's desk, their notches matching the locks of the basement chain. Further, ledgers in the Holloway study contained lists of numbers and initials whose correspondence to the children's ages and first letters of names would later be argued in court. Rebecca Dorsey, who had once fled their employ, testified that Margaret herself had delivered commands regarding meals carried below. Dorsey described Margaret's face as calm, expressionless, as though she considered such tasks routine. This revelation struck the community deeply, for it suggested not madness or impulse, but cold persistence, a household where cruelty was woven into daily life. Other discoveries compounded the unease. Within the chamber itself, Deputies found not only shackles but crude bedding, scraps of clothing, and in one corner, an assemblage of notebooks. Though many pages had decayed from damp, portions remained legible. In Jacob's hand, they contained notes that read more like observations than confessions, records of weight, measures of endurance, remarks on the tolerances of youth, and the shaping of temperament under confinement. These entries bore no overt explanation, but their clinical tone suggested a purpose beyond mere sadism. Such revelations introduced a new layer of fear. If the Holloways had kept children chained for years, it was not solely for labor or concealment. Something more systematic lurked beneath. A program of observation, perhaps even experiment. Local physicians were divided. Some argued that the notes reflected a disturbed obsession with growth and behavior, while others whispered that Jacob may have sought knowledge akin to what European atomists were rumored to pursue in secret. Whatever the truth, the notebooks dissolved any hope that the family might plead ignorance. The community's response wavered between outrage and denial. Some neighbors, desperate to preserve their own reputations, insisted they had long suspected the Holloways but feared to speak. Others clung to disbelief, arguing that respectable figures could not possibly have orchestrated such horrors. Yet the material facts lay open. 47 children, chains, records in Jacob's own hand. Denial could no longer shield anyone. In the weeks that followed, surviving children were dispersed among households willing to receive them. These acts of charity, however, were fraught with complexity. Many of the rescued had forgotten their original names, answering only to nicknames given within the basement. Some shrank from human contact, reacting violently to sudden movement or loud voices. A few refused food unless it was delivered in small bowls and placed on the floor. The damage was not only physical but woven into memory and behavior, and caretakers found themselves unprepared for the weight of such scars. Local newspapers, hesitant at first, soon spread the story. Their accounts framed the Holloway case as both atrocity and spectacle. Words like dungeon, hell beneath a house, and farm of horrors appeared in bold print. Some papers exaggerated, claiming hundreds of victims. Others downplayed, urging caution, lest Virginia's reputation suffer. Amid the noise, the facts risked distortion, but the essence remained. The Holloway household, once a symbol of propriety, was now a monument to calculated cruelty. Investigators widened their scope. They traced Jacob's business dealings, discovering unexplained profits and shipments that did not match recorded harvests. Whispers arose that he had sold labor quietly, disguising children as hired hands leased to distant farms. While evidence remained circumstantial, it added to the portrait of a man who viewed human life as commodity, subject to ledger and transaction. Margaret, meanwhile, attracted suspicion of another. A diary fragment later attributed to her contained lines about purity of blood and the necessity of pruning branches. Some interpreted these as reflections on genealogy, others as rationalizations for the removal of certain children. Whether genuine or forged, the fragment fueled rumors that the Holloway crimes were tied not only to profit, but to twisted notions of family lineage and inheritance. By early 1835, the community no longer asked if the Holloways were guilty, but rather how deep the guilt extended. Records hinted at accomplices, neighbors who had turned blind eyes, merchants who had profited silently, perhaps even officials who had accepted hush money. The basement had been the entrance, but the corridors of implication stretched far beyond stone wall. Amid this darkness, small flickers of humanity persisted. Hutchinson, the field hand whose report had set events in motion, was lauded quietly, though not publicly, for many feared praising him too openly might invite Holloway reprisal from loyalists. Sheriff Crawford, though criticized for his prior inaction, became a symbol of vigilance once he acted decisively, and Rebecca Dorsey, though trembling with every testimony, stood firm despite threats whispered against her. These figures reminded the community that silence need not be universal, that conscience could yet break through complicity. Still, for every act of courage there lingered a question unspoken in courtrooms and taverns alike. Why? Why 47 children, hidden and shackled? Why the notebooks, the records, the deliberate concealment? Profit alone seemed insufficient, cruelty alone too senseless. A darker rationale hovered, one that investigators could not fully articulate, but that survivors carried in their silence.
The Holloway estate, once bustling with wagons and gatherings, now stood abandoned under guard. Locals avoided the path, claiming the house groaned at night, that faint voices still rose from beneath, though the chamber lay empty.
Whether superstition or memory, the fear was real enough to chill even the boldest traveler. Thus the case entered its second phase, not merely the exposure of a hidden crime, but the revelation of its mechanisms and implications. With each discovery, the Holloway name sank deeper into infamy, and the community faced the possibility that the evil unearthed was not isolated, but woven into their very soil. When the Holloways were finally brought before the Richmond court in the spring of 1835, the courthouse square overflowed with faces. Some had traveled days to witness the proceedings. Others came out of duty, curiosity, or dread. The Holloway case had already consumed the region's imagination. By then, the story was no longer merely about 47 children discovered in chains. It had grown into a parable of corruption, cruelty, and the hidden depths of human capacity for evil. The trial was set against a backdrop of mounting tension. Local authorities had little precedent for crimes of such magnitude. Virginia's legal code of the 1830s was well equipped to prosecute theft, assault, or murder, but it lacked language for systematic abuse spanning decades, involving dozens of victims whose very identities were fractured by trauma. The Holloway's defense attorneys seized upon this gap, arguing that while the evidence suggested irregularities, there existed no statute clearly defining their acts as crimes on the scale alleged. Their strategy was not to prove innocence but to exploit ambiguity, yet ambiguity faltered in the face of testimony. The first to take the stand was Rebecca Dorsey, the young servant who had once fled Holloway employment. She spoke in a trembling voice, her words punctuated by long silences, but when pressed she recounted the daily rituals of carrying food down narrow stairs, of hearing muffled cries behind stone walls, of Margaret's cold instructions delivered without hesitation. The courtroom hushed as she described the moment she realized those cries were not echoes or animals, but children. Dorsey's testimony ignited both sympathy and hostility. Some in the gallery whispered admiration for her courage. Others muttered doubts, accusing her of exaggeration for revenge. The Holloway's attorneys attempted to discredit her, pointing to her youth, her departure under strained circumstances, and her reliance on memory. But her words lingered nonetheless, etched into the proceedings like an echo that would not fade. Next came the doctors. They provided clinical reports of the rescued children, their voices steady though their hands sometimes shook as they pointed to notes and measurements. They described bones weakened by malnutrition, scars from restraints, and developmental delays consistent with prolonged confinement. One physician, Dr. Marcus Whitfield, spoke plainly. These conditions are not the consequence of chance. They are the result of deliberate restraint and calculated deprivation. His statement reverberated through the chamber, a blunt refutation of any defense that the Holloways had been ignorant landlords. The children themselves were rarely brought to court. Most were deemed too fragile, their psychological state too compromised to endure the questioning of lawyers. But one child, a girl of perhaps 14 who had come to be known publicly as Rebecca after Dorsey's testimony, insisted on speaking. She described years of darkness, of learning to whisper so as not to invite punishment, of older children teaching younger ones how to remain still when footsteps passed overhead. She recalled how some children simply stopped speaking, fading into silence before slipping into death. Her testimony broke the composure of even seasoned jurors. Several wept openly. A judge called a recess so the chamber might collect itself. Newspapers later described her as the pale witness, a fragile emblem of suffering who nonetheless displayed more fortitude than many adults around her. From that day, her name would be tied inseparably to the Holloway case. The defense, cornered by such accounts, sought to redirect blame. They suggested that Jacob alone bore responsibility, that Margaret was a passive participant, even a victim of her husband's influence. They pointed to the patriarchal order of Southern households, arguing that wives were bound to their husband's authority, but correspondence found in Margaret's belongings contradicted such portrayal. Notes in her handwriting instructed servants, listed supplies destined for the cellar, and referred cryptically to the keeping of order below. Whatever Jacob's role, Margaret's agency was undeniable. As the trial dragged on, the community itself fractured. Some citizens, horrified, demanded swift execution. Others recoiled from the spectacle, fearing that exposure of such atrocities within Virginia's borders would tarnish the state's reputation irreparably. There were whispers of conspiracies,
that Northern abolitionists had exaggerated the case to slander the South, that political rivals sought to discredit local gentry by sensationalizing crime. These rumors revealed not simply fear of truth, but a deeper reluctance to confront the possibility that respected families could commit acts beyond comprehension. Meanwhile, the evidence piled higher. Investigators presented the Holloway notebooks, damp pages bearing Jacob's handwriting. They read passages aloud, notes of children's weights, annotations of reactions to cold or starvation, remarks about how obedience may be secured when speech is removed. Such words sent shudders through the chamber. These were not drunken ramblings or casual cruelties, but the calculated reflections of a man treating human suffering as experiment. The prosecution argued that the Holloways had not merely confined children, but transformed their basement into a laboratory of endurance. They painted Jacob as a man obsessed with testing the boundaries of life, and Margaret as the keeper of order, who ensured the system functioned day by day. The term scientific cruelty began to circulate in the press, a phrase both sensational and chilling in its accuracy. The broader implications unsettled many. If such practices could occur in one household, could others exist undetected? Were orphanages, poorhouses or plantations across the South hiding similar secrets? The Holloway trial thus became more than a judgment on two individuals. It became a referendum on the systems that allowed children to vanish without record, on the willingness of neighbors to dismiss cries in the night, on the blindness of communities to horrors conducted in plain sight. Tension mounted as verdict approached. Prosecutors demanded death for both Jacob and Margaret, citing not only murder, but crimes against humanity. Though the phrase itself had not yet entered legal vocabulary, the defense pleaded for leniency, arguing that evidence, though disturbing, did not prove intent to kill. They painted the deaths as tragic accidents born of mismanagement rather than malice. The jury deliberated for days, torn between sympathy for the children, revulsion at the evidence, and unease at condemning members of a prominent family. Finally, in late June, they delivered their verdict, guilty of multiple counts of murder and unlawful confinement. The courtroom erupted in a mix of cheers and sobs. Jacob Holloway sat expressionless. Margaret fainted and had to be carried from the room. Yet even with the guilty verdict, justice remained elusive. Appeals followed, bolstered by the Holloways' wealth and connections. Influential figures whispered that executions would disgrace Virginia, urging instead for quiet imprisonment. Rumors swirled of bribes, of letters to governors, of plans to smuggle the Holloways abroad. The community, once unified in outrage, began to fracture further as politics entwined with morality. For the children, the verdict brought little relief. They remained scattered among households and institutions, grappling with nightmares that no law could erase. Some adjusted slowly, finding comfort in new families. Others withdrew permanently, their lives truncated by trauma. Rebecca, the girl who testified, withdrew from public attention, placed with a Quaker family in Pennsylvania, who promised her peace. She would live long, but never again would she speak publicly of her child. The trial, however, ensured that silence was no longer possible for the broader society. Newspapers across the country covered it extensively. Northern abolitionist presses seized upon the Holloway case as evidence of Southern depravity, while Southern papers urged restraint, accusing outsiders of exploiting tragedy. Pamphlets were printed, sermons delivered, debates ignite. What began in a sealed basement now spilled into national discourse, shaking foundations of law, morality, and identity. In the months following the verdict, the Holloway house stood empty, guarded only by deputies who rotated weekly. Locals avoided the property, claiming the land carried a heaviness that resisted cultivation. Some reported seeing faint lights in the windows at night, though no lamp was ever found. Others swore they heard children's cries carried on the wind. Whether superstition or truth, the Holloway estate became a haunted monument, a place where memory and myth interwove. Thus Part 3 closed with the Holloways condemned, yet their fate still contested, their legacy already etched into the darkest annals of Virginia history. The trial had brought facts into daylight, but it had also revealed the depth of denial, complicity, and the long shadows cast when evil hides behind respectability. By the autumn of 1835, investigators realized that the Holloway household was not merely an aberrant family tragedy, but a nexus of something far larger. Sheriff Benjamin Crawford, once thought provincial in his methods, pressed tirelessly for records, correspondence, and testimony. that pointed beyond Clark County. What he uncovered unsettled even hardened federal marshals. Among the notebooks seized from Jacob Holloway's desk were letters that bore unfamiliar seals. Some were signed with initials only. Others carried the faint impressions of wax stamps, suggesting affiliations with households across Virginia, the Carolinas, and even as far south as Georgia. Their contents were couched in coded language, references to deliveries, youthful stock, and promising subjects. At first glance, these might have been dismissed as trade in livestock, but juxtaposed against the seller's evidence, their meaning was unmistakable. The Holloways were participating in a commerce of children. One name appeared repeatedly: Henry Whitcomb, a planter in coastal South Carolina with ties to Charleston's merchant elite. His correspondence with Jacob described the endurance of the smaller ones, and compared notes on methods of confinement. Another name, blurred by ink but legible enough, was Dr. Samuel Bryce, a lecturer at Charleston Medical College. He had written admiringly of Jacob's systematic observations and requested detailed accounts of how long children could subsist under particular conditions. These were not idle curiosities, they were inquiries cloaked in professional tone, suggesting experiments masked as science. The most disturbing letter, however, came from an unknown correspondent, who signed only as dated September 1833. It described a gathering held on Holloway property, a demonstration, as the writer phrased it, to show prospective patrons the durability and adaptability of the children acquired. Witnesses later corroborated that in that autumn, wagons bearing unfamiliar marks had arrived at the estate. For years, neighbors assumed such gatherings were harvest festivals or trading fairs, but the letter revealed their true nature: exhibitions where children were displayed, tested, and even ordered, as though they were commodities. Pierce, the servant who had initially broken silence, provided testimony confirming these gatherings. He recalled evenings when Jacob invited men of stature into the barn, where a handful of children were brought forward under torchlight. Their tasks varied: lifting weights, enduring cold water, reciting lessons. What seemed to outsiders like unusual displays of obedience were in truth demonstrations of how thoroughly the Holloways had broken the wills of their captives. Crawford, horrified, described the events in his official report. The children were handled as one would livestock, inspected for teeth, for posture, for docility. The gentlemen present took notes, and in some cases placed orders for particular ages or conditions. Payment, I am told, was arranged through coded drafts, never in plain coin. The breadth of this network became clearer when federal raids, coordinated from Richmond, struck multiple sites simultaneously in late warehouses in Charleston, barns outside Savannah, and private homes in Georgia yielded additional captives. Over 100 children in total. Many bore signs of the same conditions observed in the Holloway basement: malnutrition, restraints, and an eerie condition silent. The raids also uncovered ledgers, revealing transactions that had moved sums exceeding hundreds of thousands of dollars. For the era, this was a fortune, rivaling profits of cotton and tobacco. The revelations implicated more than obscure figures. Among those arrested were 2 physicians from Charleston Medical College, both previously considered men of learning. Their participation shocked the public. These were not fringe experimenters, but respected educators, who had lectured to hundreds of young men. Their trials would later reveal deliberate infections of children with disease, crude surgeries without anesthesia, and prolonged observation of suffering, all under the guise of medical inquiry. The Holloway case, once confined to Clark County, now threatened to expose the complicity of Southern gentry, professional men, and even politicians. Records seized from the Holloway home referenced a legislator from Georgia as a frequent client, though his name was carefully omitted in most documents. Investigators later identified him through circumstantial evidence. Despite overwhelming suspicion, he avoided indictment, shielded by political connections. Public reaction was immediate, and visceral. Newspapers dedicated entire pages to the revelations. The Richmond Enquirer called it a commerce of horror, unprecedented in our republic. Northern presses seized upon it as evidence of moral decay in the South, while Southern editors scrambled to downplay or discredit the finding. The Charleston Courier dismissed the testimonies as abolitionist fabrications, yet the paper could not explain why federal marshals had produced rescued children, whose bodies bore undeniable scars.
Perhaps most chilling were the financial ledgers uncovered. These detailed precise payments: $200 for a boy of 10, sound of body, pliant of will; $350 for a girl of 8 with aptitude for endurance; Some prices reached staggering heights when particular traits were sought: pale eyes, unusual strength, or simply docility. To see human life reduced to categories and sums horrified even seasoned investigators. In Richmond, legislators debated the implications. If networks such as these could thrive undetected for decades, how many children had vanished unrecorded? How many officials had been bribed to look away? Court transcripts revealed that orphanages and poorhouses had supplied children under the guise of adoptions. Judges had signed orders declaring children abandoned, thereby permitting their sale. The corruption extended so deeply that no institution appeared immune. As the inquiry expanded, so too did the mythos surrounding the Holloways. To some, they were no longer simply a family of cruelty, but symbols of systemic rot. Ministers preached sermons likening them to biblical figures of depravity. Pamphlets circulated bearing titles such as the House of Chains and the Virginian's Shame. For the first time in American discourse, the phrase "another Holloway case" entered common parlance, a warning whispered in communities whenever vulnerable children were placed in questionable care. The human toll, however, remained most haunting. Of the 47 rescued from the Holloway cellar, fewer than half survived the first year of freedom. Malnutrition, untreated disease, and the psychological toll proved too great. Their graves dotted churchyards from Virginia to Pennsylvania, silent memorials to what had been endured. Those who survived carried scars both visible and hidden. Some never spoke again, others struggled with recurring fits, or an inability to remain indoors without panic. One case in particular drew attention. A boy named Elias, estimated at 12 years when rescued, displayed remarkable intelligence despite years of deprivation. Taken in by a Quaker family, he quickly learned to read and write, astonishing teachers with his progress. Yet he also bore nightmares so severe that neighbors often heard his screams in the night. He would live only into his 20s, succumbing to illness compounded by frailty. His brief life became a symbol of both resilience and tragedy, frequently cited in sermons and reform tracts. As the network unraveled, pressure mounted on authorities to enact reform. For the first time, legislators debated federal oversight of child welfare, a notion previously unthinkable in a society wary of central authority. Though progress was slow, seeds were planted for future laws. The Holloway case became a catalyst, demonstrating that without oversight, cruelty could flourish behind locked doors. Yet even as arrests multiplied, frustration grew. Many prominent names slipped through the cracks. Some fled abroad before indictments could be served. Others leveraged political allies to ensure charges were quietly dismissed. The sense of unfinished justice lingered, gnawing at those who had risked everything to expose the crimes. By the close of 1835, the Holloway estate itself stood as a ruin. Its basement, once the site of unimaginable suffering, was sealed with stone and mortar by order of the court. Locals avoided the grounds, swearing that faint cries still carried from beneath the earth on cold nights. The fields lay fallow, overgrown with briars, as if the land itself rejected cultivation. No buyer could be found at auction, and the property fell into disrepair, a scar upon Virginia's landscape. What had begun as a whispered suspicion in a small town had now become a national reckoning. The Holloway case exposed not merely the cruelty of one family but the fragility of systems meant to protect the vulnerable. It revealed how corruption, profit, and indifference could weave together into something monstrous. And yet, as reformers would later lament, the full truth was never known. Correspondents hinted at other networks, other basements, other names. Some leads were followed, producing scattered arrests. Others dissolved into rumor. The question lingered: how much remained hidden, buried in archives, concealed behind facades of respectability? The Holloways had fallen, but the system that enabled them still pulsed in the shadows. The Holloway estate yielded many horrors, but none more chilling than the papers left behind by Jacob and his associate. These were not the jotted ravings of a cruel man, nor the idle notes of a farmer dabbling in curiosity. They were methodical, organized, and calculated, written in a hand that strove for precision, as though every cruelty might be redeemed, if dressed in the robes of science. The first ledger, bound in cracked calfskin, bore the title "Observations on Juvenile Endurance." Inside, Jacob catalogued nearly a decade of experiments upon the children confined below his floors. He noted their ages, often approximate,
their conditions on arrival and their responses to various deprivation. The entries read like farm accounts. Boy 6 withheld sustenance 3 days, survived with diminished vigor, but carried the cold precision of someone convinced he was contributing to knowledge. Cross-references in the margins revealed correspondence with physicians in Charleston. Most prominent among them was Dr. Samuel Bryce, a lecturer in anatomy. Bryce's replies, copies of which survived, urged Holloway to extend the periods of deprivation to establish maximum thresholds, and to observe carefully the transitions between lucidity and delirium. He encouraged Jacob to record pulse, respiration, and visible muscular tremors. It was pseudoscience, grotesquely misapplied but cloaked in the language of inquiry. What made these documents especially damning was the inclusion of sketch. By candlelight, Jacob had drawn crude but recognizable outlines of the children, annotating the growth of bones, the swelling of joints, the wasting of flesh. Some figures showed torsos with lines indicating the spread of sores. Others depicted the curvature of the spine under prolonged confinement. To the untrained eye, they resembled anatomical studies. To the seasoned investigator, they revealed the extent of suffering endured. In another volume labeled Trial Regimens, Jacob detailed the forced feeding of spoiled grains, the administration of tinctures and exposure to cold and damp. One entry described how a girl of about 8 was placed in the root cellar with only a jug of water during December frost. Jacob noted, endured 5 nights, expiration on the 6th, body stiff, skin mottled, pulse ceased 3:20 a.m. His hand drew a small star in the margin, perhaps his mark for a completed trial. The Charleston physicians, when confronted in court, admitted to receiving such records but insisted they had assumed them exaggerated or fictive. One testified, "We believed Mr. Holloway was an eccentric gentleman farmer, conducting rustic observations upon lives. That he meant children was unthinkable, yet their written replies betrayed no such doubt." One letter from Bryce praised Jacob's fortitude in pushing boundaries where lesser men falter. Another encouraged examination of the cranial sutures at death, to determine whether premature ossification might be observed. Among the seized documents was a folded packet labeled simply Bryce's request. Inside were instructions for dissection, to open the chest cavity of the deceased and record the volume of the lungs by submersion. Jacob had scrawled notes confirming at least 3 such procedures. The remains of these children were never recovered. The medical college in Charleston attempted to distance itself. Its faculty convened emergency meetings, denouncing Bryce and his colleague Dr. Horace Bell, who had also exchanged letters with Jacob. But whispers circulated that lectures given in 1832 and 1833 contained material suspiciously similar to Holloway's notes. Students recalled demonstrations involving unusually small cadavers, introduced as orphans unclaimed by whether these bodies were obtained through legitimate channels or by darker means remained uncertain. What is undeniable is that the Holloway papers circulated quietly among certain circles of American medicine for decades afterward. A copy of Observations on Juvenile Endurance resurfaced in Philadelphia in the 1850s, cited anonymously in a journal article on childhood physiology. Even in later years, echoes of Jacob's cruel studies appeared in footnotes, stripped of context but perpetuating his grim legacy. The investigators who pored over the Holloway archives were themselves shaken. Sheriff Crawford wrote privately to a colleague, "I fear I have read the words of a man who thought himself a scientist but was not but a torturer." These pages, written without malice in their tone, are more terrible than the chains and irons, for they show intent, patience and pride. Among the rescued children, attempts were made to confirm the experiment's account. Physicians in Richmond examined them, comparing scars to Jacob's diagrams. A boy named Thomas bore marks on his chest consistent with incisions. He recalled haltingly being held down while the master cut and sewed. A girl named Ruth had curvature of the spine so severe that surgeons believed she had been forced to remain bound in a crouched position for years. Jacob's notes corroborated. Ruth, confined to the box, observed progressive warping of bones, useful for study. The most haunting detail emerged from entries labeled the quieting methods. Jacob experimented with herbal concoctions, laudanum in diluted form, mixtures of belladonna, even scrapings of foxglove. Children were dosed and observed for hours. Jacob recorded their slowed pulses, their glassy stares, their eventual collapse. In several cases, the doses proved fatal. One entry concluded with the words, "effective quieting," though final. These revelations shattered any remaining illusion that the Holloways were merely profiteers. They were experimenters in suffering, treating children as material, and they were not alone. Physicians lent their counsel, colleges tacitly received their findings, and men of influence shielded them from scrutiny. The courts in Richmond, overwhelmed by the sheer volume of evidence, struggled to determine charges. Murder, abduction, conspiracy, each seemed too narrow to encompass the scale. Prosecutors presented Jacob's ledgers as proof not only of criminal acts but of deliberate, systematic cruelty under the guise of science. Defense attorneys argued the notes were fabrications or misinterpretations, but the meticulous handwriting and cross-referenced letters undermined such claims. The surviving children, when brought into court, sat silent as excerpts of the ledgers were read aloud. Witnesses noted their stillness, their eyes fixed on the floor. When asked if they remembered the experiments, most would not or could not reply. Only one, Elias, whispered, "The book is true." Public reaction to the medical angle was explosive. It was one matter for the Holloways to be condemned as depraved. It was another for learned physicians to be implicated. Sermons thundered against the false priests of science. Pamphlets circulated naming Bryce and Bell as traitors to humanity. Students at the medical college rioted, some defending their professors, others demanding resignations. The institution teetered on collapse, its reputation permanently scarred. Yet beneath the outrage, curiosity lurked. Some physicians privately admitted the data, though cruelly obtained, offered insights into starvation, exposure, and childhood resilience. Rumors spread of copies changing hands in Europe, where anatomists sought American observation. In this way, Jacob's legacy seeped beyond Virginia, staining the very foundations of medical inquiry. For reformers, the medical records became a rallying cry. They argued for stricter oversight of anatomical studies, for protection of the poor against exploitation, for recognition that children were uniquely vulnerable. In pamphlets and speeches, they repeated a grim refrain: never again a Holloway. But the ink of Jacob's hand remained. Bound in cracked leather, sealed in court archives, his ledgers sat as silent witnesses to a period when cruelty masqueraded as science. Those who read them, judges, clerks, historians, spoke of a lingering unease, as if the words themselves carried contamination. One clerk resigned, writing, "Each night I dreamed the figures rise from the page, the children staring at me from between the lines." Thus Part 5 closes not on the cellar itself, but on the papers that outlived it. They proved that suffering had been measured, catalogued and preserved, and that knowledge, once written, can never truly be destroyed. The Holloway case reached the courts of Richmond in the winter of 1835, and the proceedings immediately attracted national attention. Word of the basement of chained children had already spread far beyond Virginia. Newspapers in New York and Boston ran serialized accounts, and pamphleteers in Philadelphia printed lurid engravings of children shackled in stone cells. But when the trials began, the public was confronted not with sensational drawings, but with the measured pace of legal ritual. The prosecution faced a daunting challenge. Never before had such a sprawling crime involving abduction, imprisonment, trafficking and medical experimentation been brought before an American court. Jurisdictional questions abounded. Were the Holloways to be tried for the murders committed in their cellar, the kidnappings across state lines, or the conspiracy with physicians and planters in the South? Each charge carried its own evidentiary burdens, and each threatened to collapse under the sheer weight of complexity. To avoid paralysis, the Commonwealth's attorneys chose a narrow path. The first indictment named Jacob Holloway and Ezra Holloway in connection with the unlawful imprisonment and deaths of 6 children whose remains had been positively identified from the burial chamber. Constance Holloway was charged separately with conspiracy and procurement. This strategy allowed prosecutors to present the most direct evidence without immediately entangling themselves in the wider network of complicity. The courtroom itself became a theater of unease. The Holloways, once pillars of their community, sat in iron restraints under the gaze of neighbors who could scarcely reconcile the image of familiar farmers with the monstrous evidence presented. Constance, dressed in black silk, held her chin high, as though daring the world to condemn. Jacob, gaunt and pale, scribbled notes even as witnesses described his atrocities. Ezra stared at the floor, unshaven and sunken-eyed, his silence more unnerving than any protest.
The first days of testimony centered on the physical evidence. Sheriff Crawford described the descent into the basement, the stench of rot, the sight of 47 children bound in chains. Deputy Webb corroborated his account, adding details of the burial chamber where small bodies lay stacked like firewood. The courtroom fell silent as Webb's words conjured the cellar anew. Several jurors wept openly. One fainted and had to be excused. Next came the ledgers and letters. Court clerks read aloud Jacob's meticulous entries, his charts of starvation and cold exposure. Each phrase landed like a hammer blow. Boy, 7 withstood hunger 4 days. Girl, 8, spine bending under confinement. The jurors listened with expressions of horror, the calculated neutrality of scientific language amplifying the cruelty. The letters from Charleston physicians were introduced, their references to endurance thresholds and cranial examinations, leaving little room for doubt about complicity. Defense attorneys attempted to object, arguing that the writings were inadmissible without proof of authorship, but handwriting experts confirmed the entries as Jacob's, and several surviving children recalled seeing him record observations after punishments. The judges ruled the documents admissible, sealing the Holloway's fate. The most harrowing testimony came from the survivors themselves. Rebecca, 14 years old and gaunt from years of captivity, was led trembling into the witness stand. The courtroom hushed as she described how Constance had lured her from her Pennsylvania farm, how she awoke in chains beneath the Holloway house, and how she endured 5 years of systematic torment. Her voice faltered as she recalled the punishments: being locked in a box for days, denied water, forced to watch as others perished. When asked about Jacob's role, she whispered, "He wrote everything down. He said we were lessons." Other children followed. Elias, scarred from crude incisions, testified to being strapped to a table while Jacob cut into his chest to see how my breath worked. Ruth, her back permanently twisted, described the cramped box where she had been confined for months. Their testimonies were delivered in broken sentences, punctuated by tears and long silences, yet their words, halting as they were, painted a picture so vivid that even seasoned court officers turned away. The defense pursued a predictable strategy. They suggested that the Holloways were victims of misunderstanding, their cellar a misguided attempt at charity gone awry. They claimed the children had been orphans taken in during hard times, and that Jacob's notes were exaggerated philosophical musings, never meant for practice. Constance's attorney argued that she had merely managed the household, unaware of the cruelties below. But the accumulation of evidence made such defenses hollow. The turning point came with the testimony of Dr. Marcus Whitfield, the itinerant physician who had treated the Holloway. Under oath he revealed how Constance had requested sedatives, nutritional tonics, and remedies for malnourished children. He described her peculiar interest in doses that would subdue without killing. Most damningly, he admitted she had once asked him how long a child might survive without food if given only water. "I thought she spoke hypothetically," Whitfield confessed, his hands trembling. "Now I see it was no hypothetical at all." This testimony pierced the last veil of doubt. Constance was not an ignorant wife, but an active architect of cruelty. The jury's faces hardened as her mask of composure slipped, her lips tightening at Whitfield's words. Outside the courtroom, tensions ran high. Crowds gathered daily, some demanding swift justice, others whispering fears that the Holloway's wealthy correspondents would intervene. Anonymous threats were delivered to prosecutors, warning them to abandon the case. A surviving child, Timothy, disappeared from protective custody and was never found. Rumors swirled of powerful Southern families moving to silence witnesses. The trials became not merely a question of guilt, but of whether law itself could prevail against entrenched power. Despite the intimidation, the proceedings pressed forward. The jury returned its verdict in March 1835, guilty on all counts for Jacob and Ezra, and guilty of conspiracy and procurement for Constance. Sentencing was swift. Jacob and Ezra were condemned to hang, Constance to life imprisonment. The decision was met with cheers in the courtroom and outrage in certain circles beyond Virginia. Pamphlets defending the Holloways appeared in Charleston, portraying them as martyrs to overzealous Northern morality. Others decried the leniency of sparing Constance the gallows. Yet the trials did not end with the Holloways. The evidence had opened a door onto the broader network of complicity. Grand juries in Pennsylvania, Maryland, and South Carolina began investigating missing children linked to Holloway's ledgers. Federal marshals pursued physicians whose correspondence with Jacob had surfaced. The Charleston Medical College dismissed Dr. Bryce and Dr. Bell,
Though both fled before they could be formally tried, rumors persisted that they continued their studies abroad. The most sensational follow-up trial involved Henry Blackwood, the plantation magnate whose letter specifying requirements for children had been discovered in Constance's papers. Blackwood's wealth and influence initially shielded him, but the testimony of Samuel Pierce, his former overseer, broke through. Pierce described in harrowing detail how children purchased through the Holloways were worked to death, beaten for sport and used in experiments. His words shocked even hardened jurists. Though Blackwood employed the finest attorneys, the evidence was overwhelming. He was convicted of murder by proxy and conspiracy. His sentence, life at hard labor, a rare humiliation for a man of his station. Still, many escaped justice. Other planters implicated in the records avoided prosecution through political connections. Several physicians resigned quietly and vanished into obscurity. The trials illuminated the breadth of the network, but they also revealed the limits of law in confronting entrenched systems of exploitation. The Holloway executions drew immense crowds. On the morning of June 12, 1835, Jacob and Ezra were led to the gallows in Richmond. Eyewitnesses reported Jacob remained defiant, declaring he had been a student of truth until the end. Ezra wept openly, begging forgiveness. Both were hanged before a hushed assembly. Their bodies were buried in unmarked graves, their names destined to live on only in infamy. Constance's fate was slower. Confined to a women's prison in Virginia, she maintained her innocence until her death. 12 years later, visitors reported she grew increasingly delusional, insisting she had acted under divine instruction. Her cell, when searched after her death, contained scraps of paper covered with strange notations, echoes of Jacob's ledgers, written in her own hand. The trials left a profound mark on American society. They exposed the dark intersection of science, commerce, and cruelty. They demonstrated the fragility of law when confronted with wealth and power, yet also the capacity of ordinary witnesses, Rebecca, Whitfield, Pierce, to force truth into the open. For decades afterward, reformers invoked the Holloway case as proof of the need for child protection, for oversight of medical institutions, and for vigilance against networks of exploitation. But for the survivors, the verdicts offered little solace. Rebecca, Elias, Ruth, and others were placed in foster homes or charitable institutions. Their scars, physical and emotional, carried into adulthood. Some vanished from records, their names swallowed by history. A few left testimonies later in life, describing how they never escaped the shadows of the cellar. "We were freed," one wrote, "but we were never whole." Thus the Holloway trials stand not merely as episodes of justice, but as reminders of law's limitation. They brought punishment to a few, shame to many, but they could not restore what had been lost in the damp stone of that Virginia basement. The Holloway affair did not end with the clatter of gallows beams or the slow decline of Constance in her cell. Its shadow lengthened across the American landscape, etching itself into law, medicine, religion, and the collective imagination. In the years that followed, few events of equal horror were so thoroughly debated, recorded, and woven into the fabric of reform. Yet the Holloway case also revealed how deeply evil could be accommodated by ordinary structures, and how easily society recoiled from the full implications of what had been uncovered. Legal precedents. One immediate consequence was the acceleration of child protection law. In Virginia, the legislature convened in late 1835 to address what newspapers called the Holloway atrocity. The resulting statute, an act for the safeguard of orphaned and destitute youth, established the first formal state oversight of orphanages and poorhouses. No longer could children be removed or placed without documentation. Adoption, hitherto a largely informal arrangement, now required judicial approval. Other states soon followed. Pennsylvania passed its own version in 1836, spurred by reports that Rebecca and other survivors had been lured from its farmlands. Maryland, New Jersey, and New York drafted similar measures by the end of the decade. Though unevenly enforced, these statutes marked a shift in how American society conceived of childhood, from a commodity vulnerable to barter, to a condition meriting legal protection. Yet loopholes persisted, wealth and influence still bent the rule. In South Carolina, legislators attempted to block federal marshals from investigating planters implicated by the Holloway ledgers, citing state sovereignty. Cases languished or collapsed for lack of jurisdiction. The Holloway case thus exposed not only the cruelty of individuals, but also the structural inadequacies of a system unprepared to confront crimes that crossed borders and classes. Medical repercussions. The revelations about medical participation struck a particularly raw nerve. The Charleston Medical College faced scandal when it was revealed that 2 of its faculty had corresponded directly with Jacob Holloway. Though the men fled abroad before trial, their letters remained requests for data on the effects of cold immersion and charts of cranial compression. When these documents were published in the Richmond Examiner, public outrage forced the college to enact reforms. By 1837, new regulations required explicit consent from guardians or overseers for any human experiments conducted in medical school. Lectures on medical ethics, previously a rarity, became standard in curricula. Some reformers, like Dr. Marcus Whitfield, turned the Holloway revelations into rallying cries, publishing treatises that warned against the seduction of science by cruelty. His pamphlet on the boundaries of experiment circulated widely, urging physicians to remember that knowledge bought with suffering is knowledge corrupted. Nevertheless, the scandal left scars. For decades afterward, whispers persisted that certain physicians had avoided exposure only by burning correspondence. Students at Charleston spoke of hidden archives, locked away in private collections, where Holloway's data was preserved and consulted. Whether these rumors were true remains uncertain, but their persistence reflected a cultural unease, the suspicion that medicine in its hunger for progress might again trespass into the cellar. 3. Religious and moral response. The clergy seized upon the Holloway case as proof of moral decay. Sermons thundered against the idolatry of science and the inhuman commerce of children. Ministers drew parallels between the Holloway's cellar and biblical images of hell, warning congregants that sin could fester even beneath the respectable facades of farmhouse and chapel. Quakers, long advocates for abolition and child welfare, became prominent voices in the reform movement. It was among Quaker families in Pennsylvania that Rebecca found her final refuge, and her story was retold in Quaker tracts as an example of endurance and renewal. Methodist and Baptist congregations in Virginia, by contrast, wrestled with shame. Many Holloway supporters had been parishioners, their respectability masking a complicity that now seemed indefensible. The religious response was not purely spiritual. Churches organized charitable societies to provide oversight of orphans, widows, and abandoned children. These efforts laid the groundwork for later institutional networks, blending moral duty with practical relief. Yet they too struggled with the tension between vigilance and intrusion. The specter of the Holloway cellar lingered, a reminder that even communities bound by faith could be blind to evil in their midst. Of cultural memory. The Holloway case seeped into American culture in strange and enduring ways. Pamphleteers sold lurid woodcuts of chained children, while traveling lecturers recited the survivors' testimonies on stages across the North. Ballads circulated, describing the Virginia cellar, where innocence was shackled. Some of these accounts exaggerated, others sanitized, but all contributed to the story's survival. In Millbrook itself, memory was more complicated. For years, townsfolk avoided mention of the Holloways, preferring silence to shame. The Holloway farmhouse stood empty after government seizure, its windows boarded, its cellar sealed. Local children dared each other to approach it on moonless nights, whispering that voices could still be heard from beneath the earth. In 1845, the house was demolished, the basement filled with stone and lime. A modest cemetery was erected nearby, its headstones nameless, but inscribed, "For the children lost." Yet forgetting was impossible. Whenever a child went missing in the region, rumors of another Holloway cellar flared. Parents warned their children not to stray, invoking the Holloway name as a cautionary tale. The horror entered folklore, its details shifting with each retelling, but its essence unshakable. Beneath ordinary life lurks a darkness capable of unspeakable cruelty. Political reverberations. Politically, the Holloway affair revealed the uneasy alliance between reform and resistance. Northern newspapers used the case as evidence of Southern depravity, drawing connections between the Holloway's trafficking and the broader institution of slavery. Southern editors in turn accused Northerners of exploiting tragedy to attack their way of life. The debate foreshadowed divisions that would deepen in the decades ahead. At the federal level, the case catalyzed the first tentative steps toward national legislation on trafficking and interstate crime. Though watered down by compromise, the statutes granted marshals expanded authority to pursue abductors across state lines. In the halls of Congress, legislators spoke of closing the Holloway gap. Still, progress was slow, and many argued that the true lesson had been blunted by politics. The survivor's burden. For the children who lived through it, legacy meant something more personal, and more difficult. Rebecca married in Pennsylvania, bore children and lived quietly until her death at 70. She never again spoke publicly of the cellar, but her descendants preserved her testimony as a family relic. Elias drifted westward, laboring on farms in Ohio before vanishing from records. Some claimed he died in an asylum. Ruth, bent and frail, lived into her 40s, often described as the woman who walked like a child. Their stories rarely appeared in official records, but they circulated in whispers and local accounts, shaping the human understanding of what had been endured. For reformers, they became symbols. For neighbors, they were reminders. For themselves, they remained prisoners of memory long after the chains were struck. A broader lesson, the Holloway case thus carved its place, not only in statutes and sermons, but in the very way Americans conceived of hidden danger. It warned that atrocity could unfold in silence, shielded by respectability, abetted by indifference. It forced recognition that cruelty need not erupt in distant battlefields or foreign lands. It could dwell in the cellar of a farmhouse, within the reach of every passerby who failed to look close. Even now, nearly 2 centuries later, historians describe the case, not merely as a criminal episode, but as a lens into society's contradictions. It showed the limits of progress, the fragility of conscience, and the ease with which children, the most vulnerable, could be made invisible. In that sense, the true legacy of the Holloway cellar is neither the executions nor the reforms, but the warning it bequeathed. Vigilance must never rest, for cruelty thrives in the spaces we choose not to see. By the spring of 1836, the threads pulled from the Holloway cellar had become a tangle too vast for any one court or commission to contain. What began as the discovery of a single basement in Millbrook now revealed itself to be a lattice of cruelty, a network that extended from the Virginia hills to the coastal ports, and inward to the very halls of medicine and power. The true scale of the Holloway's enterprise was only beginning to emerge, and its unveiling would horrify even the most hardened investigators. The ledgers revisited. The first intimation of this greater breadth came with the careful study of the Holloway ledgers, recovered from a locked chest hidden beneath a loose hearthstone. At first glance, the volumes appeared to be ordinary farm accounts, entries of grain sales, livestock tallies, tool purchases, yet interspersed among these pages were lists written in an entirely different hand, with initials, ages, and cryptic notation. When investigators cross-referenced these notations against court petitions for missing children, they discovered correspondences too exact to be dismissed. A 10-year-old marked J.S. Strong lungs matched the disappearance of Joseph Sanderson from a Norfolk parish. N. Eyes gray, cries often echoed the report of Margaret Tiller, vanished near Richmond. In total, nearly 60 such correspondences were confirmed, with dozens more likely. The ledgers were not mere inventories, they were programs of suffering. Next to certain names were marginalia, to Charleston, tested in water, demonstrated. It was that last word, demonstrated, that froze even the most seasoned reader. The demonstration.
Testimonies from survivors filled in the terrible meaning of that word. Rebecca, in her deposition, spoke haltingly of nights when strangers arrived at the farmhouse. The children would be gathered, their chains struck off for the moment, and arranged in rows. Lanterns were lit. Men in black coats, some with the posture of physicians, others with the curiosity of merchants, would observe as Jacob Holloway conducted what he called exhibitions. Rebecca described being forced to swallow concoctions until she vomited while the men scribbled notes. Others were made to hold heavy stones while their limbs quivered, until collapse brought laughter from the observers. In the darkest accounts, children were placed into coffins with narrow air holes, the lids hammered shut while a watch was kept on how long their screams persisted. These were not mere punishments, they were demonstrations of endurance, marketability, and experimental novelty. Elias confirmed that some children were taken away immediately after such nights. He recalled one boy, no more than 9, purchased outright by a man from Charleston, never to be seen again. Another was escorted by a physician who spoke of further study. For the children who remained, the cellar became not only a prison but a stage, where suffering was performed for the profit and amusement of men who arrived in silence and departed before dawn. 3. The buyers. Who were these buyers? The investigations traced some to medical institutions, others to plantation owners, and a few to private individuals whose motives remain obscure. Letters seized from the Holloway correspondence revealed that Charleston served as a hub, with shipments routed discreetly along the coast. One note, written in a fine, educated hand, instructed, "The girl of 12 must be unmarked, no bruises. Ensure she arrives with hair combed and in clean dress." In Philadelphia, rumors swirled of physicians boasting about Southern specimens procured through hidden channels. A prominent merchant was quietly investigated after one ledger line, paid by LFP, was thought to refer to him. No charges stuck. His wealth insulated him. Yet the suspicion clung, a reminder that evil rarely confined itself to the obscure or the impoverished. The buyer's anonymity was fiercely protected. Many documents were destroyed before seizure. Witnesses died or disappeared. What remains today are fragments, suggesting that the Holloways were but one cell in a network larger than any tribunal could unravel. The sealed rooms. When the farmhouse was searched more thoroughly in 1836, deputies discovered 2 additional chambers hidden behind the cellar walls. The first contained racks of instruments, iron vises, clamps and devices whose purposes were obscured by rust and disuse. Some bore bloodstains, others fragments of fabric. The second chamber was more ghastly still, a series of narrow pits dug into the earth, each just wide enough for a small body. Several skeletons were recovered, their bones showing signs of deliberate trauma: fractured ribs, deformed skulls, and vertebrae warped by unnatural pressure. These rooms confirmed what the ledgers only implied. The cellar had been not only a holding pen but a laboratory of cruelty, where children were tested, displayed, and discarded. The discovery horrified even Sheriff Crawford, a man not easily shaken. He later testified that the smell lingered on his hands for weeks, no matter how often he washed them. The revelations in court. When the case reached Richmond in late 1836, the courtroom became a theater of horror. Survivors were brought forward, trembling as they recounted nights of exhibition. Doctors presented evidence of malnutrition, scars, and bone deformities. The ledgers were displayed before jurors, their ink still dark with specificity. But the most damning moment came when a letter was read aloud, one in which Jacob Holloway described his cellar as a place where the limits of human endurance are to be measured, and where commerce finds its finest subjects. The phrasing chilled the gallery. The notion that suffering could be so neatly paired with profit struck at the moral core of all who listened. Public reaction. News of the demonstrations spread quickly through newspapers, sermons, and pamphlets. The public had already been aghast at the chained cellar, but this new revelation that suffering had been performed for audiences, purchased like entertainment or used as data for medical progress, provoked outrage of a deeper order. Crowds gathered outside the courthouse, demanding the harshest penalties. Editorials thundered that the Holloways had turned children into spectacles, their agony made currency. Ministers decried the affair as a glimpse of hell itself brought into Virginia. For many, the case became a moral mirror, forcing society to reckon not only with the Holloways' depravity, but with the structures that had permitted buyers, observers, and neighbors to look away. The full scale emerges. By the time the investigations closed, the number of children linked to the Holloway network stood at nearly 147 discovered in the cellar, 23 confirmed as sold through ledgers, and dozens more missing with circumstantial ties. Whether all had perished or some survived in distant anonymity could never be proven. The records were incomplete, and silence often guarded the most damning truths. Yet the scale was undeniable. The Holloways were not eccentric torturers hidden in one farmhouse. They were conduits in a system, a grim intersection of commerce, pseudoscience, and cruelty that stretched across states, implicating men of standing and institutions of learning. The breaking point, for Sheriff Crawford, for William Hutchinson, for Rebecca and the others, the climax came not in the courtroom but in the recognition of this system. The basement was not an isolated atrocity. It was the visible wound of a deeper sickness, one that could not be cured by executions alone. This realization haunted those who had witnessed the cellar firsthand. Many spoke of dreams in which the sound of rattling chains continued endlessly, reminding them that the children whose names had been reduced to initials were never fully recovered. For the community of Millbrook, the breaking point came when silence was no longer possible, and the cellar, once hidden beneath the farmhouse floor, became the most infamous room in Virginia. By the winter of 1836,
When the court in Richmond handed down its final judgments, the Holloway affair had already surpassed the narrow boundaries of a criminal trial. The evidence, the testimonies, the grisly discoveries beneath that Virginia farmhouse, all had conspired to expose something larger than any one family's depravity. What emerged was not only the record of a crime but the revelation of a society's complicity, a mirror lifted to an America reluctant to gaze too long at its reflection. Beyond the Holloways, it would have been simpler, even comforting, to dismiss Jacob and Constance Holloway as aberrations, singular monsters, whose cellar stood apart from ordinary life. Yet the ledgers, the correspondence and the faint trails of money and silence proved otherwise. The Holloways had not acted alone. They had thrived in an ecosystem where buyers, observers and neighbors played roles, whether active or passive. Rebecca's testimony made this plain. She remembered not only the hands that bound her, but the eyes that watched, belonging to men who returned to their homes and livelihoods without consequence. They were not demons, she told the court. They were men with clean boots and books in their pocket. They smiled as though nothing were amiss. This detail was more terrifying than any rumor of occultism or madness. It implied that evil did not require aberrant minds or hidden sects. It required only the willingness of ordinary men to treat suffering as spectacle and children as instruments. The medical stain, perhaps the most damning revelation, lay in the sphere of medicine. When Jacob's letters to physicians were read aloud, the gallery fell into uneasy silence. Phrases like cranial compression yields promising uniformity, and observe resilience under duress, bore the unmistakable cadence of scientific language. The implication was undeniable. Respected practitioners had entertained, even encouraged, the Holloways work. Though names were carefully shielded, the suggestion that universities and hospitals had indirectly benefited shook public trust. If medicine, the very institution meant to heal, could be seduced by cruelty masquerading as data, then who was safe from corruption? In Philadelphia, pamphlets appeared condemning the science of the cellar, warning that progress purchased with agony was progress steeped in rot. Yet rumors persisted that Holloway notes had been smuggled into private collections, studied behind closed doors long after the farmhouse was razed. Whether true or exaggerated, the belief alone testified to a cultural wound. The suspicion that the pursuit of knowledge could still conceal the stench of that cellar. 3. The neighbors' silence. Equally disturbing was the role of silence. Millbrook had lived beside the Holloways for decades, their farmhouse a fixture on the hill. Neighbors admitted hearing strange cries, seeing children led at dusk into the barn, or noticing wagons arriving at odd hours. Yet few had spoken, and those who did, like William Hutchinson, were ignored until the cries grew too loud to deny. The court confronted this silence but could not prosecute it. Silence is not easily legislated, yet its revelation was damning enough. Evil had flourished not in isolation but in the cracks left by apathy, politeness and fear of meddling. In this sense the community bore a share of guilt, however unwilling it was to name it. The broader mirror. To many reformers, the Holloway cellar became a metaphor for the nation's own contradictions. In sermons and editorials, parallels were drawn between chained children in Virginia and enslaved men and women in the fields beyond. Both, they argued, revealed a society willing to treat human beings as instruments, whether for labor, commerce, or curiosity. Southern newspapers bristled at this analogy, insisting the Holloway case was an isolated horror. But Northern editors pressed the comparison, suggesting that the true revelation was not a cellar in Millbrook, but an entire economy built on exploitation. The debates grew heated, foreshadowing conflicts that would soon engulf the country. The limits of justice. When Jacob Holloway was hanged in Richmond and Constance consigned to her cell, the public clamored for closure, yet many sensed that justice had been incomplete. The buyers had not been named. The physicians implicated in correspondence had fled or denied their role. The skeletons in the hidden chamber were interred without identities, their stories lost. For the survivors, justice was an even more elusive word. No sentence could restore stolen years, mend bent spines, or erase the memory of chains. Rebecca spoke of her gratitude to those who had freed her, but she admitted in private letters that freedom felt fragile, as if the cellar lies always just behind me waiting to open. Thus the revelation cut deeper. Punishment could be meted out to individuals, but the system, the soil that had nourished the cellar, remained largely untouched. The moral reckoning. Historians now regard the Holloway affair as a moral reckoning disguised as a criminal case. It forced Virginians, and by extension Americans, to confront questions that reached beyond law. How many looked away? How many justified their complicity under the guise of custom, profit, or curiosity? And how many more cellars might remain undiscovered? The rhetorical power of these questions ensured that the Holloway name endured not only as a warning but as a symbol. To speak of another Holloway in the decades that followed was to invoke suspicion of hidden cruelty, to remind citizens that respectability could conceal rot. 7. A revelation without end. Even after the farmhouse was razed and the cellar sealed, the revelations did not cease. Survivors carried their memories westward, into new towns and families, where whispered stories kept the horror alive. Ministers invoked the Holloways in sermons long after the trial, each retelling sharpening the moral lesson. Folklorists collected tales of chained children and wandering spirits said to rise from Millbrook's Hill. Each retelling revealed less about the Holloways themselves and more about the society that remembered them. The cellar became a symbol, mutable and enduring, of the human capacity to ignore suffering until forced to confront it. The final revelation, and perhaps the most unsettling revelation, was this: the Holloway cellar had not shocked because it was unimaginable, but because it was all too imaginable. The chains, the ledgers, the demonstrations, these were grotesque extensions of practices already present in quieter, sanctioned forms across America. The cellar was not an alien horror, but a concentrated truth, one that stripped away the masks of civility and exposed the raw face of exploitation. In that sense, the Holloway affair was not only the story of a family or a town, but of a nation forced to glimpse its own reflection in the dim lantern light of a Virginia basement. By the close of 1836, the Holloway name had become both curse and warning. The farmhouse was boarded, its cellar sealed with stone and lime, and the last of its furnishings auctioned under a gray December sky. What remained, beyond the broken timbers and scattered possessions, was not a family's ruin but a story that refused to die. The house removed, local authorities faced a peculiar problem in the months after Jacob's execution: what to do with the Holloway farm. The land was fertile enough, but no buyer dared claim it. Too many had seen children carried from its cellar on stretchers. Too many had heard the clatter of chains as the soil was disturbed. Even laborers hired to dismantle the house swore that cries lingered in the beams and rafters, echoes that no hammer could silence. By 1840 the structure was razed entirely, its cellar filled and capped with a crude stone marker. No family ever settled there again. Travelers along the Richmond Road passed quickly by, lowering their voices, as if sound itself might stir what lay buried beneath. Survivors and scars, the children rescued from the Holloway cellar, carried the mark of their ordeal long after the trial faded from memory. Some, placed with families in Pennsylvania or Ohio, managed to build modest lives. They married, worked and raised children of their own. Yet even in such ordinary acts, the past intruded. One survivor, interviewed decades later, confessed he could not endure the sound of iron striking stone. It recalled shackles clattering against the cellar floor. Rebecca's story became the most widely known. After years of struggle, she found peace with a Quaker household near Philadelphia. She lived into old age, surrounded by grandchildren, though she never again spoke publicly of the cellar. Those who knew her recalled moments when she would fall into sudden silences, eyes distant, as if listening to sounds no one else could hear. 3. Justice deferred. Though Jacob was hanged and Constance condemned to lifelong imprisonment, many sensed that justice had been incomplete. The buyers named in Jacob's letters were never pursued. The physicians who received his observations slipped quietly into obscurity, some fleeing to Europe, others hiding within institutions unwilling to expose their complicity. Whispers persisted that Holloway notes circulated in private libraries, studied by men who claimed to pursue science but whose fascination bore the scent of cruelty. If true, the cellar's shadow extended well beyond its bricked walls, infiltrating the very spaces that claimed to protect knowledge and truth. Community's shame. Millbrook itself never recovered. Its residents struggled with guilt, their failure to speak sooner weighing heavily upon. In churchyards and taverns the same questions repeated. Had they truly not known? Had they chosen silence out of fear or convenience? No answer proved sufficient. Within a generation, families drifted away, abandoning the town whose name had become synonymous with neglect. By the 1850s, Millbrook was little more than a scattering of houses, its church fallen silent, its fields overgrown. Maps of Virginia gradually erased it, as if the land itself sought to forget. The national echo, yet the Holloway cellar was not forgot. Newspapers, reformers, and ministers seized upon its details to press for broader change. In Virginia, new child protection statutes were enacted, requiring oversight of orphanages and stricter rules for adoption. Federal authorities, recognizing the cross-state dimensions of trafficking, expanded the jurisdiction of marshals. More subtly, the Holloway case altered the cultural imagination. It revealed that horror did not lurk only in distant lands or Gothic fictions, but in respectable houses, behind painted shutters, among neighbors who nodded politely in church. The cellar became a symbol of concealed rot, invoked whenever communities wished to warn of unchecked secrecy or unexamined authority. The lingering presence, even after the house was gone. Stories lingered. Travelers reported hearing children's cries on moonless nights near the stone mark. Farmers swore their plows turned up bones that the original excavation had missed. Folklore blossomed. Tales of phantom chains rattling beneath the earth, of lanterns glimpsed in the fields though no one was there to carry them. Whether invention or memory, such stories testified to a truth more enduring than superstition, that the Holloway cellar had entered the realm of the collective conscience. Its horrors required no ghost to persist. The mere fact of their occurrence was haunting enough. The final warning, perhaps the most chilling aspect of the Holloway affair, was not what was uncovered, but what remained uncertain. The ledgers hinted at networks broader than Millbrook, at buyers and associates whose names were carefully obscured. Letters referenced other arrangements, other experiments, other houses where silence prevailed. If such places existed, and evidence suggests they did, then the Holloway cellar was not unique, merely the one uncovered. The true scale of the enterprise may never be known. And so, as we close this chapter, we must remember, the Holloway cellar was sealed, the farmhouse razed, the family condemned, yet its echoes they remind us that evil does not arrive cloaked in myth or madness, but hides in the ordinary, thrives in silence, and depends upon our reluctance to look too closely. If this story has unsettled you, for every stone sealed in Virginia soil, there may be others unturned, other basements whose walls have never been breached, whose chains still lie hidden in the dark. Listen closely. Even sometimes on quiet nights, it is said the wind across the Virginia hills carries the faint clink of iron, the sound of chains that were never fully broken, and if you hear it, do not turn away.